At 3 in the morning on November 3rd, 1917, artillery came down on a stretch of French trench near a village called Bathillemont. But it wasn't meant to kill anybody. It was what they called a box barrage, and its job was to trap men in place while somebody else got close. And when the shelling stopped, the Germans were already inside the wire. The men holding that trench were Americans. They had been in France for less than 3 months, and they had been put in that particular sector precisely because it was the quietest stretch of the entire Western Front. Some of the Germans spoke good enough English to get close in the dark. One of them walked up to a corporal named James Gresham and asked him who he was. Gresham told him, "I'm an American, don't shoot." He was shot between the eyes. Private Thomas Enright had his throat cut resisting capture. Private Merle Hay, 21 years old, a store clerk from Glidden, Iowa, had his skull crushed, and 11 more men were dragged back across no man's land, lined up, and photographed with their captors. Those photographs were printed as postcards and sent all over Germany as proof that these new arrivals from across the ocean were nothing to be afraid of. The whole thing took less than 5 minutes. Those were the first 3 Americans killed in combat in the First World War. They would be the first of 53,000 killed in action. And 3 weeks later, the survivors of that same company blackened their faces and went out into the dark to do it back. What was done to them that night had a name. It was called a trench raid, and by November 1917, both sides had been doing it to each other for 3 years. And this happens to every army that runs into it. First, it gets done to you in the dark, then you learn how it's done, and then you are the ones doing it. That took the British 2 years and the Canadians about 1. The Americans did it in 3 weeks. We're going to tell you everything about their way of fighting, but I have to warn you that some of what you're about to hear is hard to stomach. Now, if you're still here, let's start by understanding what led to hand-to-hand combat in what everyone thought was a modern way of fighting, and then we'll move from there. In the years leading up to 1914, European military leaders had an almost religious faith in the power of offensive action. France, in particular, still acting smart despite its humiliating defeat to Prussia back in 1871, developed the most extreme version of this philosophy. French generals preached that an army's sheer will to conquer could overcome any disadvantage on the battlefield, and they genuinely believed it was the key to victory. And if you want to know just how seriously they took this idea, somebody proposed replacing the bright red trousers of French soldiers with something less visible. It was rejected on the grounds that it would hurt this fighting spirit. Now, the bayonet stood right at the center of this whole philosophy. You see, before 1914, rifle and bayonet combinations were designed specifically to maximize reach, which was basically the ability to stab an enemy soldier before he could stab you. And this led to a sort of race where nations competed to create the longest possible rifle. The French Liebel model 1886 rifle had a bayonet blade measuring about 20 inches long with an X-shaped cross-section designed to punch through thick clothing. When you combine that bayonet with the rifle itself, you ended up with a weapon about 6 feet long. The Germans respected its deadly effectiveness so much that they gave it a nickname, the French Needle. While Germany responded in kind with their own design, the bayonet for the Gewehr 98 rifle had a blade just under 20 inches long, which created a combined length of about 5'9". And this long bayonet was specifically designed to allow infantry soldiers to bring down cavalrymen from their horses, which tells you something about how military planners were still thinking in terms of the previous century's warfare. Training was based on thrust, parry, and lunge techniques with targets identified as the throat, breast, and groin. French troops trained in formations they called elbow to elbow, specifically for maximum shock effect when they charged. And hold on to that, because there is one army that was still training this way in 1917, 3 years after everybody else had learned better. When the United States finally went to war, the official manual its infantry took with them gave 5 pages to trench warfare. 5 pages on the only kind of war anyone in France was fighting. It gave 25 to how to march in a parade and how to stand for inspection. By the way, there was one German bayonet that would become the most controversial blade of the war, the sawback bayonet. This was issued to pioneer and engineering units, and it had 29 double teeth along its spine for purely practical purposes like cutting brushwood, wire, and wood for gun positions. But when the Allies discovered them on the battlefield, they turned what was basically a tool into a symbol of Germanic barbarism, claiming that the intentionally serrated edge caused far worse wounds than ordinary bayonets. The truth was that the sawback was counterproductive in combat and likely to get caught in clothing, but that mattered little for propaganda. German soldiers became so afraid of being captured with these bayonets that most were eventually recalled and had their teeth ground off before being reissued. Now, keep that in mind, because right at the end of this war, the exact same thing happened in reverse. the German government sent a formal diplomatic protest to Washington about an American weapon. They said it was too barbaric for civilized warfare, and they threatened to execute any American soldier captured carrying one. And this was coming from the people who had introduced poison gas and flamethrowers to this war. It wasn't a bayonet. It was something you could walk into a hardware store back home and buy off the shelf. But we'll come back to that. Going back to the story, the actual war began, and those generals were eager to prove just how right their tactics were. Well, spoiler alert, you already know how the fighting in the First World War would look after just the first couple of months. The first of many catastrophes came in August 1914, when France launched the Great Offensive into German-held Alsace-Lorraine. French soldiers advanced in those bright red trousers and blue coats with bands playing and flags flying, officers leading from the front with drawn swords in the manner of their Napoleonic ancestors, and they marched directly into the killing zone of modern industrial warfare. On August 22nd, in one 24-hour period, 27,000 French soldiers were killed. That was more than on any other single day in the entire history of French warfare. So much for the revolutionary undefeatable tactic. Machine guns and artillery coupled with barbed wire mowed down infantry long before they could ever get close to bayonet range. Then the Germans suffered their own catastrophe when they tried the same thing on a massive scale. During the First Battle of the Marne, Crown Prince Wilhelm ordered 100,000 German soldiers to fix bayonets and charge the French lines in darkness. French 75mm guns opened fire into the packed grey ranks of German infantry. German units panicked in the darkness. Two German units fired on each other at almost point-blank range, and the assault suffered about 15,000 casualties. And these were just two of many battles that ended the same way early in the war. All those failed offensives and broken charges led to attempts by both sides to outflank each other. But there was a new factor in warfare that made this basically impossible. The first airplanes were now being used to provide aerial reconnaissance, which meant each side could see where the attack was coming from and prepare to meet it. New artillery and machine guns were being used on a scale nobody had seen before. Infantry charging across open ground was mowed down over and over again, and the survivors had nothing else to do but dig in wherever they stopped. Each flanking attempt was met and blocked, and as the fighting moved northward, temporary defensive positions became permanent. In attack after attack during what became known as the Race to the Sea, neither side could outflank the other, and soon both sides had settled into the trench warfare that would define the rest of the war. Opposing lines of trenches now snaked from the Belgian coast all the way to the Swiss border, creating 440 unbroken miles of fortification. You see, a revolution in firepower had not been matched by similar advances in tactics, and this created a grueling form of warfare where the defender held every advantage. There were no flanks to turn anymore. Every attack now had to be frontal, directly into prepared defensive positions. Over 4 million men had been killed or wounded in just the first 5 months, and 3,000 miles away, the country that would eventually decide how this war ended had a regular army of about 127,000 men. That was the entire professional army of the United States. It was roughly what the British were feeding into one single corps. 19 months later, it would be nearly 4 million. So what happens when everything these armies believed turns out to be wrong, and that mistake is killing thousands upon thousands of men? Well, the answer would eventually lie not in advancing weapons and tactics, but rather in going back to medieval times of swords and body armor. The obvious question for commanders was how to break through these trench lines, and the answer, at least according to military thinking of the time, was artillery. You would bombard the enemy trenches for days, sometimes even a full week, pulverizing everything in front of you. The artillery would destroy the barbed wire, collapse the trenches, kill or demoralize the defenders, and knock out their machine guns. Then your infantry would simply walk across no man's land and occupy what was left of the enemy positions. That was the theory anyway, but it didn't work like that at all. The most notorious example came at the Somme, where the British fired over 1.5 million shells during a 7-day bombardment. Commanders were so confident that they ordered soldiers not to run, but to walk, just to maintain discipline, because the Germans would surely all be dead after such a bombardment anyway. Well, that optimism proved catastrophically misplaced, and the first day of the Somme is remembered, as you know, as the deadliest day in British military history. The Germans had built deep dugouts, some of them 40 feet underground, reinforced with concrete. The soldiers inside could simply wait out even the heaviest bombardment in relative safety, and then scramble back to their firing positions and mow down soldiers walking across the open ground. And for some reason, this was so hard for the commanders to understand. They would send wave after wave after wave of soldiers over the top, and the men would die without any real success. Even if they managed to capture some section of enemy trenches, there were always 2 or 3 more lines behind it. and the attacking force would be so badly beaten up while taking the first line that they would inevitably lose it in the enemy counterattack. Everything would be right back where it started, after a day or two, with nothing accomplished except thousands of men dying. So with these massive frontal assaults proving so catastrophically useless, another approach began to emerge. Small-scale raids, hit-and-run attacks at night, not designed to break through the line and hold territory, but simply to slip in, accomplish specific objectives, and slip back out again before the enemy could respond in force. There were some early experiments happening almost as soon as the trenches formed, but the tactic really came together with the Canadians. The Canadians perfected it, and everybody eventually copied them. And the last army to arrive on this front would learn it the hard way, which is to say it would have this done to them first, in the dark, in a sector somebody had promised them was quiet. And you're about to hear why hand-to-hand combat in the First World War was very different and far more horrific than anything soldiers had trained for. Before we explain the trench raiders, let's take a look at the conditions they were about to be fighting in, and how their weapons went back several centuries. Frontline trenches were typically about 7 feet deep and 6 feet wide with 2 to 3 feet of sandbags on top. German trenches were often deeper, reaching 10 to 12 feet with timber or concrete supports. And all trenches were built in zigzag or jagged patterns on purpose. You see, if a trench ran straight, a single shell landing inside could explode down the entire length and kill everyone inside. The zigzag pattern meant a blast would be contained to just that one bay and a few unfortunate soldiers. But because of all those twists and turns, soldiers could typically see no more than about 30 feet ahead of them at any time. Now in these cramped, twisting corridors, the infantry rifles suddenly became the main problem. Armies had spent decades making them longer, with what were basically swords attached to them rather than bayonets. Bolt-action rifles that were designed for shooting at enemies 300 yards away were basically useless when fighting happened within arm's reach. Another problem was that bayonets would often get stuck in bodies. One Australian soldier watched the man next to him put a bayonet through a German and into a hardwood beam behind. Then the man could not pull it out. The bayonet had to be released from the rifle, and the poor guy was left pinned there until he died. There were even cases where 2 soldiers were found dead, having stabbed each other with their bayonets at the exact same moment. Out of situations like these, soldiers on both sides quickly figured out that a long rifle with a bayonet just wasn't the right tool for close quarters battle. And the Americans would find this out for themselves, very fast. When they arrived, they brought the Springfield M1903, which was probably the finest bolt-action rifle any army carried in this war. Some units got the M1917 Enfield instead, which was also excellent. Both of them were built around one idea, which was putting a bullet through a man at several hundred yards, with a trained eye behind it. And both of them were completely useless in a German trench at 3 in the morning. So they reached for clubs, knives, and sharpened shovels, weapons that would have been perfectly familiar to their medieval ancestors. The weapon that would eventually make a foreign government threaten to hang Americans is not on that list yet. Trench clubs became the weapon of choice for night raids. They had some creative designs, like using the empty metal casings from Mills bombs fixed to wooden handles. Others took the handles from their entrenching tools and added weights, then drove hobnails all around the head. Some looked like morning stars from the Middle Ages with those iron spikes. There were even clubs with flexible coils for extra striking power. So much for the modern way of fighting. Trench knives came in all kinds of varieties, and every army ended up with its own. The most famous of them all was American, and I'm going to come back to it later. The story of how that knife got designed, thrown away, and designed again tells you more about how the Americans fought this war than any statistic will. These knives were issued completely blackened to prevent any glinting in moonlight that might give away a raider's position. But among all these improvised weapons, the shovel proved to be the most effective of all. It was much better for striking because of its weight, and soldiers sharpened the edges, so it did terrible damage wherever it landed. And unlike the bayonet, it wouldn't get stuck. Now this return to medieval times went beyond just weapons. It extended to armor as well. The Germans first issued body armor. However, the steel breastplates weighed over 20 pounds, so they were only practical for sentries and machine gunners in stationary positions, not troops who had to run and fight in them. The Americans experimented quite a bit with the Brewster body shield, a 40-pound thing made of chrome nickel steel that could actually stop a rifle round, but it was anything but practical, so it was never used on the battlefield. Which tells you roughly where the American Army's head was in 1917. They were designing armor for a war that not one of them had actually seen yet. Now that you understand why these medieval weapons came back, let's go into the raids and how they performed in practice. A handful of men crawling through the darkness could get past the machine guns that would have mowed down a mass assault. They didn't need to cut through barbed wire across an entire front, just find or make a single path through it. They didn't need to overrun a whole trench system, just get into a specific section, do what they came to do, and get out. And because they operated at night without those massive artillery bombardments announcing their arrival, they could achieve surprise in a way that the big attacks never could. But this was only if everything went according to plan, which was rare. And the side being raided was learning too. Everything the Canadians worked out in the dark would come back 4 years later in daylight, on a scale nobody had planned for. While all armies eventually developed trench raiding, the Canadians elevated it to an art form and became the experts at violent nighttime trips into enemy territory. The first major organized trench raid of the war happened on February 28, 1915, when 100 men of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry attacked German positions near Saint-Éloi. They destroyed 30 yards of German trenches, while the raid cost 5 killed, 7 wounded, and 2 missing. Canadians made another big raid on Petite Douve Farm. 170 volunteers prepared for 10 days with scout patrols, training, and rehearsals. Artillery shelled the enemy wire beforehand, while raiders stripped off anything that could identify them if captured. At 2:30 in the morning on November 17th, they attacked. They achieved complete surprise because the German sentries had taken cover from the rain. In just 20 minutes, they killed around 30 Germans and captured 12 prisoners, along with valuable intelligence, including new rubber gas masks. The casualties were only 1 man killed, and that was by accidental friendly fire, plus 1 slightly wounded. You see, the objectives of these raids weren't really about taking ground. The most common purpose was intelligence gathering, capturing prisoners who could be questioned to find out which units were facing you, and whether reinforcements were being brought in, and things like that. Raiders also tried to destroy valuable equipment like machine guns, wreck dugouts, and simply kill as many enemy soldiers as possible to wear down their numbers. Beyond the practical value, there was also a psychological reason. High Command believed that constant raiding kept the troops aggressive and alert, maintaining what they called the offensive spirit. And there was one more thing a raid could do, which was humiliate. Think back to those 11 Americans, lined up and photographed with the men who had just killed their friends. Those pictures were printed as postcards and posted across Germany. And there was another purpose that was darker and more cynical. In many sectors, soldiers on both sides had developed what became known as a live and let live system. Basically, informal truces where both sides quietly agreed not to shoot to kill. There were agreements not to shell the latrines or not to attack during breakfast. However, officers used trench raids deliberately to break these arrangements and force their men back into active fighting. Before going over the top, raiders blackened their faces with burnt cork or brown grease. They wore thick rubber gloves to handle barbed wire silently and protect their hands. All rattling gear and shiny objects were stripped off. And stripped off meant more than it sounds like. Identity discs stayed behind in the assembly trench. Letters and photographs, anything at all that could tell a German officer who you were if he was going through your pockets afterward, were piled up at the start line before you went out. Even the bayonet scabbards came off, because metal touching metal carries about 20 meters on a quiet night, and 20 meters was further than you needed it to carry. Raiders carried those weapons we mentioned, optimized for close-up silent killing. Then when silence no longer mattered, they used bombs and pistols, and operations were timed to a maximum of 20 minutes, so they could hopefully slip back before enemy reinforcements arrived. Now, carrying out a trench raid was an extremely dangerous and complicated business, and the raiders had a whole series of obstacles that could get them killed at any stage. The first challenge was simply crossing no man's land, which was usually several hundred yards across, though in some places it could be as narrow as 30 feet. The terrain itself was a nightmare of mud and shell craters, littered with debris, rotting corpses, and tangles of barbed wire. Raiders moved on their bellies, crawling forward inch by inch through the darkness. The main thing, as one soldier put it, was patience. If you went slow enough and kept on your belly, you couldn't be heard or seen. The wire was a major obstacle. The belts were sometimes 30 feet wide and 5 or 6 feet tall, with multiple rows of iron stakes and strand upon strand of barbed wire. Some had empty tins hung on them that would rattle and give warning if anyone touched the wire. Wire-cutting parties would sometimes go out nights before the raid to cut paths, so the raiding party would spend less time in the open. At any moment during the crossing, raiders faced the terrifying possibility of illumination. Both sides used starshells, which were artillery rounds that burst at a certain height and lit up a magnesium flare hanging from a small parachute. When one went up, it blazed brightly for a minute or more, lighting up no man's land like midday sun. The Germans also used pistol flares that gave light for 10 or 15 seconds. The instant raiders saw a flare going up, they would freeze, not daring to move until the light died. Any movement caught in the glare would bring down machine gun fire immediately. One veteran explained that you had to keep your head down and your eyes closed because if you watched the light, your eyes would reflect it, and the enemy sentries looking into the darkness would spot you more easily. Then there were the sentries to take care of. Both sides kept listening posts out in no man's land in front of the main trench line, specifically to detect enemy parties. If they spotted anything suspicious, they would immediately raise the alarm and the whole front would start firing into no man's land. So raiders had to find these listening posts and either avoid or silence them. Standard practice was to creep slowly up on the sentries and then kill them as quietly as possible in the silence of the night. Enemy patrols were another danger. Both sides sent men out into no man's land at night, so there was always a chance that a raiding party would run into an enemy patrol doing the same thing. These encounters could turn into desperate hand-to-hand battles in the shell holes and craters of no man's land. Raiders and patrols also learned to read the quiet. No shots, no flares, and it meant one thing. The other side had a patrol out there too. When two patrols of opposing sides accidentally met in no man's land, they sometimes let each other pass without fighting because they both knew that if someone started shooting, the whole front section would open up and nobody was coming back to their line. And this is exactly why those 3 Americans died. They had been forbidden to send patrols out into no man's land. The French had given that order, and they had given it to keep the Americans alive. These were brand new troops, and nobody wanted them killed before they were any use to anybody. But no patrols meant no listening posts of their own out in front. It meant nobody out there in the dark, and it meant there was no way on earth to notice a German assault company forming up in the wire. George Marshall, who in the next war would command every Allied soldier there was, later put the blame for that night squarely on that one order. Once the raiders reached the enemy trench and dropped inside, the brutal and up-close fighting began immediately. And remember those zigzags? Remember that the trench was built in bays with those thick corners between them so that one shell couldn't wipe out a whole line of men. Well, those same corners meant a raider dropping into that trench could never see more than one bay ahead of him. He had no idea whether the next section held nobody or held 8 men who had just woken up. So there was a method, and every army that raided ended up at the same one. The lead man gets to the corner of the bay. He releases a grenade around that corner into the next section. The second man counts it down, and the instant it goes, he comes round the corner into whatever the blast has left behind in the few seconds before anybody still alive in there is able to fight back. Then the next bay and the next one, all the way down the trench. And the American answer to that problem did not exist yet. Their first attempt at it would break in their hands. Every second spent in that trench was another second for enemy soldiers in neighboring sections to grab their weapons and come running, so they had to make it count. They used the chaos and confusion, killed as many soldiers as they could, threw grenades into dugouts, destroyed equipment, and if possible, captured prisoners. Then the return journey was usually the most dangerous part of all. The raiders were now moving quickly, possibly dragging unwilling prisoners or wounded comrades through no man's land back to their lines. Machine guns and artillery could sweep across no man's land at any moment. In all that chaos and darkness, many raiders lost their bearings completely. They would jump into a trench with relief and then realize they had made a terrible mistake. They came back to the enemy trench, where the soldiers inside weren't quite happy to see them. Friendly fire was another concern on the return, even if nothing else had killed you somehow. The sentries in your own trench knew a raiding party was out, but in the confusion of darkness and incoming fire, it was easy for an understandably nervous man to shoot at shapes coming over the parapet. There were password systems, and hopefully the sentry on the parapet had been told what the password was. But then sometimes the sentry was relieved and the new one didn't get the information about the raiding party that might be coming back in a few hours. And all of this effort, all of this risk, was for objectives that often seemed trivial to the men who were dying doing them. The officers 30 miles behind the lines wanted to know what was happening on the other side of no man's land, so they simply ordered someone to go and take a look. Many trench raiding operations were never mentioned outside of command because the men simply went out and none of them ever returned. And even if the raid was successful without many casualties, it would likely only bring retaliation the following night. So that was trench raiding, as the British, the French, the Canadians, and the Germans had worked it out by 1917. 3 years of it, every single lesson in there paid for by somebody. And then a completely new army turned up that had learned none of it. When the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, its entire regular army was about 127,000 men. There was a National Guard on top of that, another 180,000 or so. But they were state troops. They weren't federal soldiers yet, and none of them had been anywhere near a war like this one. And it goes deeper than the numbers anyway. There was no general staff in the modern sense. There were no divisions, not the way European armies meant that word by 1917. There was no doctrine at all for the kind of war being fought in France. And there was no domestic production of any of the weapons this war had already proved you needed. No machine guns, no modern artillery, no aircraft, no gas equipment, no tanks, which meant that most of the weapons Americans would end up fighting with had to be handed to them by the people they had come to help. General John J. Pershing arrived in France in May 1917 with a small staff and the job of building a 2 million-man army out of essentially nothing, on a continent that had already been at war for 3 years. And the French and the British, who were watching their own armies bleed out, had a very simple request. Give us the men now, feed them into our divisions as replacements. We'll train them, we'll lead them, and they'll be useful in weeks instead of a year. Pershing said no, flatly. The American army would fight as an American army under American command, or it wouldn't fight at all. There were good reasons for that decision, and there was a real cost to it. And the cost was this. Every one of those men now had to be trained from zero in France, in the middle of a war, by an army that didn't know how to fight it. And it gets worse, because Pershing had already decided what was wrong with this war before he even landed. He thought the Allies had gone soft. He thought that 4 years in a trench had turned their armies into purely defensive instruments, and that what this war actually needed was aggressive infantry out in the open, with the rifle and the bayonet. He called it open warfare. And remember that manual I mentioned, 5 pages on trench warfare, 25 pages on parades. That was the doctrine the Americans brought with them. Now the French assigned instructors to the American training areas, veterans whose entire job was to hand over everything 3 years had cost them. And Pershing's staff officers were worried about it. Their concern, in the words of one analysis from the time, was that these instructors might pollute the men with their ideas about trench warfare. Well, luckily for the men, nobody in the training areas was listening. The 16th Infantry Regiment trained at Gondrecourt with the 47th Chasseurs Alpins, the Blue Devils, French Mountain Infantry, and some of the most experienced close-quarters fighters in Europe. And what they taught was not theory. How to listen in the dark for the sound of a German patrol forming up in the wire. How to read the rhythm of the enemy's flares, and move only during the seconds of black in between them. How to strip a raiding party down until there was nothing left on a man that could rattle. 25 pages of parade formation did not come up. They were learning, but they were not there yet. One American from this early period, Private Quincy Mills, later said this: "I shot 6 Germans sneaking up on me one night, and when daylight came, they were all the same tree stump." A veteran knew what a rat sounded like in the wire. He knew the difference between a man crawling and a rabbit that had been startled by moonlight. These men had to learn all of that from experience. And on the night of November 3rd, 1917, before they had learned it, a German raiding party found them. You know what happened next? Gresham, Enright, Hay, and 11 men in a photograph. But here's the part I left out. 3 weeks. That is how long it took. 3 weeks after having a raid done to them, the survivors of Company F blackened their own faces and went out through the wire into no man's land to do it to somebody else. That is not a long time to go from being the victim of something to being good at it. And later in the war, when the Germans took American prisoners, one of the Germans is supposed to have said something that stuck with the men who heard it. "If only we could have met you in 1915, when we too were young." This is the part I want to stop on because it is what the whole thing comes down to. Every army that walked into 1914 believed the same thing, that the next war would be decided at range, that the rifle had made everything older than the rifle irrelevant. They spent 30 years and enormous sums of money making that true, and they were completely correct, right up until the moment 2 men were standing in the same 6 feet of ditch, and at that range, none of it had ever mattered. What mattered was a shovel with the edges filed down. The most advanced societies on Earth spent 4 years and a generation of men discovering that the shortest way to kill somebody was the one their great-grandfathers had used. Armies gradually developed purpose-built weapons for trench fighting. The pistol, which had previously been just a secondary weapon or something officers carried, became essential for raiding parties. The British Webley revolver worked well in mud, but it only held 6 rounds. The Colt M1911 was highly prized by the Americans, while the Germans had their Luger. Not for show. In a trench bay, with no room to work a bolt and no time at all to reload, the only question that actually matters is how many rounds you can put out before the situation resolves itself, one way or the other. 2 pistols meant more rounds. Plenty of men carried a captured Luger or Mauser as the second one. And when Colt couldn't build M1911s fast enough to keep up with the army, the government issued a .45 caliber revolver as a stopgap. The MP-18 was the real breakthrough for trench fighting. Chambered in 9mm, firing at about 400 rounds per minute from a 32-round drum magazine, it gave German stormtroopers devastating firepower in the tight spaces of trenches. Only about 3,000 actually saw frontline combat. But the MP-18 proved the concept worked, and it set the pattern for most submachine guns that came after it. The American contribution to trench weapons was the infamous Winchester Model 1897 trench shotgun. The most interesting thing about this gun was what they called slam fire. Unlike modern pump-action shotguns, the M1897 didn't have a trigger disconnector, which meant it fired every time the action closed as long as the trigger was held down. A trained soldier could fire all 6 shells in about 2 seconds. At that range, in a trench, everything in front of him got hit. They fitted it with a perforated steel shield over the barrel so you could still hold the thing after firing it, and an adapter on the muzzle so you could fix a bayonet to a shotgun. The soldiers called it the trench sweeper and the trench broom. Winchester delivered just under 20,000 of them. Remington built about 3,500 more of its own version, and they went to the men doing the raiding. And this is that protest I mentioned earlier. On the 19th of September, 1918, the American Secretary of State received a cable from Berlin. The German government protests against the use of shotguns by the American army and gives notice that every American prisoner found in possession of such a gun or of its ammunition is to be sentenced to death. The American answer came back short. If the German government carries out that threat in a single instance, it will be the right and the duty of the United States to make such reprisals as will best protect the American forces. And notice is hereby given of the intention to make them. So there it is. The nation that had introduced chlorine, phosgene, and the flamethrower to this war had decided that the American pump-action shotgun was the weapon that crossed the line. The Germans dropped it and the shotguns stayed. Now, that knife I promised you. The first American trench knife was the M1917, a triangular spike of a blade designed to punch straight through a thick winter uniform, mounted on a cast-iron knuckle duster grip with spikes along the guard. On paper, it was exactly right. In practice, the join between the blade and that cast-iron handle was not strong enough for what men were actually doing with it, and the handles broke in the middle of using them. So the soldiers did what soldiers always do when the gear fails. They made their own out of files and cut lengths of rebar, or they got hold of French knives off the units next door. The American Ordnance Department's own paperwork from this period describes the demand, and I'll read it as written, for hundreds of thousands of murderous blades, backed by the momentum of heavily weighted handles. The replacement was the M1918 Mark I. They went and studied the French knucklebow trench knife, the one French assault troops had been carrying into German trenches since 1915, and they rebuilt it the American way. Longer handle, a single piece of cast brass for the whole grip, threaded the entire way through, so there was no join left in it to snap, and a heavy reinforced cap on the end of the handle, put there deliberately so that the knife still worked as a weapon when you didn't want to use the blade at all. It had none of the elegance the French or the Italians brought to their blades. It was an American answer to a problem. Find the fault, overbuild the fix, then make 100,000 of them. There was never an official American trench club, by the way. Regimental carpenters and individual soldiers just made them out of whatever the trench had lying around. Broken timber, pick handles, barrel staves with hobnails driven in, lead poured into drilled holes, or dead grenade casings screwed onto the end. The close quarters killing in the trenches also forced armies to develop proper hand-to-hand combat training, and every army started running programs in jiu-jitsu, boxing, and wrestling. As the war ground on, both sides began to realize that small-scale raiding, while useful, would never win the war by itself. What was needed was a way to apply those same principles of speed, surprise, and close-quarters violence on a much larger scale. And that is exactly what the Germans set out to create. They created the first official stormtrooper units, with an idea that would change trench warfare and show the first reliable way to break the deadlock. Instead of attacking the whole width of the front like every failed offensive before, stormtroopers would attack key points only. They would completely bypass strong points, leaving those for the follow-up waves to deal with, and seep into the enemy's rear to overrun artillery batteries and command posts. The idea was to cut frontline troops off from their headquarters and supply depots, and the whole system would collapse from within. Now, this was a completely different approach from the trench raiders we've been talking about. Raiders would slip in, gather intelligence, and slip back out. Stormtroopers had a different objective. They would create breaches that regular infantry could then pour through and exploit. This required a complete change in how commanders thought about battle. Junior officers were encouraged to lead through their own personal judgment rather than waiting for orders from above, because independence, quick thinking, and resourcefulness were what made it work. And the men themselves were volunteers, mostly under 25, with athletic backgrounds. It worked, and soon the Germans would get their chance to use it on the front that actually mattered. When Germany ended the war with Russia in March 1918, nearly 50 divisions were transferred west. For the first time since 1914, Germany actually outnumbered the Allies on the Western Front. This was their chance to win the war before American troops arrived in overwhelming numbers. The spring offensive began with over 1 million shells fired in just 5 hours, the biggest artillery barrage of the entire war. Fog on the morning of March 21st allowed stormtroopers to slip deep into British positions without being seen. They achieved the deepest advances on the Western Front since 1914, pushing forward 40 miles in 2 weeks. For the first time in years, warfare became mobile again, and for the first time since 1914, it looked like it might work. But the problem was that the Germans had not expected such success, and they weren't adequately prepared to take advantage of it. Stormtroopers quickly moved faster than their own artillery could follow, and supply lines collapsed over the cratered wasteland the artillery had created. The best men had been pulled out of regular units and concentrated into storm units, and these elite soldiers suffered disproportionately heavy casualties that simply couldn't be replaced. The offensive eventually stalled, and this failure was part of why Germany ultimately lost the war. The Allied counterattack that followed used over 400 tanks and was the biggest combined force attack anyone had mounted to that point. Before the year was out, over 100,000 German prisoners had been taken. By the spring of 1918, Americans were landing in France at over 5,000 men a day. By June, it was 10,000 a day, and the divisions they were forming were enormous by European standards. A typical Allied division was about 10,000 men, an American division was 28,000. So even when the tactics were clumsy, and they often were, there was a weight behind the Americans that German planning had not accounted for. But it wasn't the numbers that unsettled the German army, it was something else. These men were not tired, and nobody on the Western Front had seen a soldier who wasn't tired in 4 years. The Germans found that out properly in June 1918 in a hunting preserve about a mile long and half a mile wide called Belleau Wood. The 4th Marine Brigade attacked across open wheat fields into German machine guns, with no artillery support and no accurate maps of the ground. In one battalion, more than half the men were killed or wounded within a few hours. But the ones who got to the tree line found themselves in a wood where you could see about 15 to 25 meters. And at 15 meters, everything you have heard in this video applies. Bayonets were used, knives were used. It took 6 major attacks over nearly a month to clear that wood. And the Germans, according to the story, started calling them Teufelshunde, devil dogs. And there's a reason some of them got good at this so quickly. A lot of the men in the American National Guard divisions had grown up in the rural South and the West, hunting difficult country, with firearms around the house, years before anybody handed them a uniform. So when it came down to one man in the dark, trying to kill another from a few feet away, some of them had been practicing for it their whole lives without ever knowing it. Let me give you 3 of them. The first one is a textbook trench raid, done as well as the best raiders on that front could have done it. Major Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, commanding a battalion of the 26th Infantry 1st Division. On the 26th of June, 1918, he planned and led a raid against German positions near Cantigny, going in at 3:15 in the morning. Through the wire, through the German trenches, and back out with 33 prisoners and the paperwork from a command post. By that point, the 1st Division had been in France for a year. They had absorbed all the French training that Pershing's doctrine had tried to keep away from them, and they had done this enough times to be genuinely good at it. And the men they hit had been told over and over again that the Americans were not yet anything to be afraid of. The second man is what happens when a raid stops being a raid. Lieutenant William Bradford Turner, 27th Division, from Garden City, New York. Williams College, class of 1914, where he lettered in football, basketball, and baseball. A big man and a trained athlete. On the 27th of September 1918, near Ronsoy in France, Turner led a platoon, about 30 men, forward in what started as a trench raid and turned into something else entirely. They took a German trench line, then the next one, then the next one. The accounts of how he fought would be recognizable to a soldier from any century. He was firing his pistol with his left hand. When a German came at him with a bayonet, he swung his right fist and knocked the man down, and Private Zert jumped into the trench and bayoneted the German where he lay. Then the 2 of them stood back to back and cleared the trench with grenades before moving on to the next position. Turner is credited with killing at least 16 Germans himself that day. He was wounded 3 times. He was killed in the 4th German trench line, holding it against the counterattack. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. 6 days before it happened, he had written to his family. "Everyone must kill at least 1 Hun," he said, "before he will have paid for his transportation." And the third man is the hunter. On the 8th of October 1918, on a ridge above Châtel-Chehery in the Argonne Forest, a corporal named Alvin York from Fentress County, Tennessee, was part of a battalion that had just overrun a German position when machine guns on the high ground opened up and cut his unit down around him. York had spent his life shooting turkey, and what he did next was, by his own account, a turkey shoot. He found a firing position below the ridge at an angle where the German guns couldn't depress far enough to reach him, which meant that to see him at all, a German had to lift his head above the parapet. Every time a head came up, York shot it. When 6 German soldiers came at him with fixed bayonets from a trench on his flank, he drew his Colt and shot them in sequence, back to front. The man at the back first, then the next one, then the next, working forwards, so that the men in front would not see the ones behind them fall and think to get down. A German officer named Vollmer, who had already emptied his own pistol at York without hitting him, and who had watched his casualties climb past any point that made sense, offered his surrender in English. York took it. He walked 132 prisoners back to the American lines. His brigade commander said it looked like he'd captured the whole German army. York said no, he'd only got 132. He went home to Fentress County, married, and lived another 46 years. Of the men in this video who went into a trench at night, he is one of the very few you can say that about. Marshal Foch, the Supreme Allied Commander, is supposed to have told York afterward that it was the greatest thing accomplished by any soldier in all the armies of Europe. Now that's an absurd thing to say, and it's worth thinking about why he said it. This was a man who had commanded at Verdun, where 300,000 men died over 10 months. He'd seen everything this war had. And what he was pointing at wasn't the prisoner count. It was that 4 years of the most intensive military training the European powers had ever attempted had not been able to produce, on demand, what that man had walked in already having. Patience. An eye. An instinct for cover and line of fire that you cannot teach an adult in a training camp in 3 months. And all of that happened inside a place I need to describe to you, because it's unlike anything else in this video. The Argonne Forest had been in German hands since the opening months of the war. 4 years. And in those 4 years, they had turned a forest into one of the most heavily fortified positions on the entire Western Front. Aerial reconnaissance was the thing that had ended the War of Movement back in 1914. Over the Argonne, the canopy was thick enough to make it almost useless. Visibility on the ground was 15 to 25 meters on a good day, and in the fog that settled into the ravines in October, you could not see the man who was about to shoot you from 15 feet away. The machine gun nests were sighted to cover each other, so attacking one brought fire from another, and the wire was laid in belts inside the undergrowth, invisible until your boot found it in the dark. You could not break a place like that with a mass assault. You could only get into it in small groups, take terrible casualties whenever the invisible guns found you, and keep going anyway. On the 2nd of October, 1918, 554 men went into a narrow valley in that forest called the Charlevoix Ravine. They were from the 77th Division, raised off the streets of New York City, out of a city where the men coming in spoke 42 different languages and dialects between them. They called it the Melting Pot Division. These were men who had grown up fighting for food and space in a city, who knew how to move in confined spaces, and how to react when violence turned up without any warning. None of that was in the infantry drill regulations. All of it turned out to be useful. They were commanded by Major Charles Whittlesey, Williams College, then Harvard Law, then corporate law on Wall Street, 9 years ahead of Lieutenant Turner at the same small college in Massachusetts, and 5 days behind him into the worst of it. The units on his left and right didn't keep pace. By nightfall, the Germans had closed in behind him. Whittlesey was now cut off, about a kilometer in front of his own lines, with no food, no water, no way to be resupplied, and no communication with anybody except homing pigeons. What followed was 5 days of snipers, grenades, trench mortars, and at one point, flamethrowers. And then on the 4th of October, American artillery received the wrong coordinates and shelled Whittlesey's own position for 2 hours. The message that went out on a pigeon that day is preserved, and I'm going to read it exactly as he wrote it. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. The pigeon got through, badly wounded. The bombardment stopped. Then on the 7th of October, the Germans sent a blindfolded American prisoner into Whittlesey's position under a white flag, carrying a note. It said that the suffering of his wounded men could be heard from the German lines, and that they were appealing to his humane sentiments to stop. And then it said this, about the man carrying it. The bearer is quite a soldier. We envy you. Think about that against the postcards from the start of this video. Whittlesey did not reply. He pulled in the white signal panels his men had been using to talk to Allied aircraft, in case anybody mistook them for surrender flags. That evening, relief broke through. Of the 554 men who went into the Charlevoix ravine, 194 walked out unhurt. The armistice came 5 weeks later, on November 11, 1918. Whittlesey came home one of the most celebrated soldiers of the war. He received the Medal of Honor, one of the first 3 given for valor in the conflict. He was promoted, and he was wanted everywhere. Speeches, parades, honorary degrees, public appearances. Every single one of them required him to stand up and describe those 5 days again. He went back to his law firm. He went to the funerals of his own men at a rate of 2 and 3 a week. He visited the wounded ones in the hospital. He found them jobs. He lent them money. He did their legal work for nothing. He said to a friend, "Not a day goes by, but I hear from some of my old outfit, usually about some sorrow or misfortune. I cannot bear it much more." On the 11th of November, 1921, the 3rd anniversary of the armistice, Whittlesey was a pallbearer at the burial of the unknown soldier at Arlington. 2 weeks later, he boarded a steamship out of New York, bound for Havana. On the first night of the voyage, he had dinner at the captain's table. The captain said afterward that Whittlesey seemed in good health and good spirits, and had been animated in a discussion about the Army-Navy game being played that day. He left the smoking room at 11:15, said goodnight, and went to his cabin. In his cabin were 9 letters he had written, to his parents, to his brothers, to his closest friends, and to his second-in-command, and with them was the original German surrender note from the Charlevoix ravine, which he had kept for 3 years. He was never seen again. His body was never recovered. His friends said afterward that they had suspected for years that he was suffering from what people then called shell shock, and that he had hidden how bad it was with exactly the same discipline he'd shown in that ravine. There was no framework in 1921 for what he was carrying, and there was no treatment for it. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't formally recognized in medical literature until 1980. Whittlesey had been dead for 59 years by then. Europe in 1914 was considered the pinnacle of modern civilization, the most technologically advanced society the world had ever seen, and yet this modern war spiraled into the most primal and savage form of combat known to man. Despite artillery, machine guns, airplanes, submarines, warships, and tanks, it all eventually ended with clubs and sharpened shovels. And for the Americans, it began with 3 men in a French trench at 3 in the morning, near a village nobody had ever heard of: James Gresham, Thomas Enright, and Merle Hay. They were buried 2 days later, in the ground behind the trench they had died in. And in the summer of 1921, all 3 were dug up and shipped home. What the French put over them in the meantime called them the first soldiers of the American Republic to fall on French soil.